has worked to develop NIBA-based approaches to support environmental decision-making for offshore oil and gas decommissioning in Australia, Arabian Gulf, California, Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of Thailand, North Sea, and Ireland. Mr. Nicolette co-authored the first formalized NIBA framework, focusing on site remediation and restoration, recognized by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the agency's Science Advisory Board, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. Joe is recognized for his natural resource damage assessment, experience and role in pioneering ecosystem service economic-based evaluation methods for evaluating economical injury and restoration. Joe was certified as a fisheries scientist by the American Fisheries Society in 1992. Joe, welcome. We will be glad to see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk about today is, when we think about decommissioning, and one of the, obviously, the decisions are, do we remove the entire structure? Do we partially remove it? Do we create a reef, move it to a reef location, or manage it in situ? There's a variety of obvious options that we can look at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the net environmental benefit analysis-based comparative assessment approach that I've been working for in quite a bit in that field for a while. And I'm going to talk about a little bit how we got here, because a comparative assessment is typically the process in which you'd identify what are the options you're going to implement for your decommissioning program. And then I'll talk a little bit about why it was developed, and then have a little bit of discussion about that as I go through that. As mentioned, I've spent over 30 years, really a lot of focus on net environmental benefit analysis, which is really a risk-benefit comparison between alternatives. How do you manage these competing alternatives? And I've worked on that since early on the Exxon Valdez spill up through Deepwater Horizon and a variety of sites as well across the world. One of the things, the first formalized framework for net environmental benefit analysis, I co-authored here with risk assessors from Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the Environmental Protection Agency. And this really served as a basis for net environmental benefit analysis and how it was developed and moved through its progress. One of the key things that net environmental benefit analysis does, it incorporates ecosystem services into that comparison process and raises questions about how do we quantify some of those values. When we think about ecosystem services, they provide an ecological habitat value. And because you have that habitat value, it also provides a variety of human use values or human use services. And those services could be direct or consumptive uses, like you can actually fish, boat, dive, and actively use the resource. But there are also values in terms of indirect uses, like passive or non-consumptive uses. Those are uses in the fact that we have a value for a habitat because it protects or supports a threatened endangered species. So there are basically existence values or bequest values associated with resources. But at the end of the day, keep in mind that all those human use services, you cannot have those if you don't have the ecological habitat services. So actions that affect the habitat can affect the value and the change in those human use service values. And I know previously Sean talked quite a bit about the value of these structures, as did Dr. Roberts. We've learned a lot over, and really I think what comes out is we've learned a lot since a lot of the regulations, and some of the regulations have been put in place, especially with OSPAR, for example, over 30 years ago. we've really learned quite a bit about what are the benefits of subsea structure. This hard structure that's been in place provides a colonizing habitat, and for benthos, which then attracts fish, which then attracts marine mammals, and so on and so forth. And then because shells in a lot of places, and each site's different, but when you have a lot of these platforms will create a shell hash area towards the bottom of the platform that actually, over time, builds into a hard substrate structure itself. And then because of all the biological activity around the platform, you have what's called a halo or shadow area of additional biological value. That's really, when you think of that all as one ecosystem, it tends to be much greater than what you see when you get outside of that zone. And so we know that fish, it's been determined it's not just aggregating fish, but fish produce there, which is really good for helping protect fish stocks, as an example. Dr. Victoria Todd worked quite a bit with marine mammals in looking at, how do they use the platforms in terms of seals, or looking at dolphins and so forth, porpoises. So there's a lot of different information that we've really found, and in a lot of these that we've looked at in the various locations, all pretty much supports some type of threatened endangered species or other types of species of special significance. And as well as Dr. Roberts mentioned as well, the connectivity is a really big deal as well. And then there's also the diving, photography, and education types of areas. And it's been mentioned before too that these really act as de facto marine protected areas, because they've had an exclusion zone, and it hasn't allowed trawl fishing and other types of intrusive activities into that zone. It's just really for the oil and gas operators to basically manage the operations at that location. So one of the things when you think about ecosystem services, an important concept is a habitat provides services, and it provides those services over time. And this is just for conceptual to understand it. And that baseline level of value may change over time, but in any event, there's value provided over time. And one of the things that we look at is, well, how long are these going to last in the environment? And it looks like these can last for quite a while, looking at degradation rates in the North Sea. I know some of the projections are between 600 and 1,000 years, depending on conditions as well, and also some projections, and that's really those projections are without cathodic protection, which is occurring on quite a few, on these subsea structures. So what happens then is, if you look at this and you think about what happens, you have this baseline level of value that this has created, which we've all talked about. If there's a point in time where you implement a full removal, well, you lose that ecosystem that you had there today, and you lose that ecosystem into the future, from that site. And basically, what that means is, because of that time frame, it's not just value to us today, but there's values that are multi-generational and intergenerational, such as existence and bequest values, or the fact that you've lost this, or declines in fish stock over what you've removed, and so on and so forth. So there can be significant impacts, so potential for significant impacts to the ecology. So when we think of a net environmental benefit analysis, we're really looking at risks and implementing options to manage potential risks. And this is just a generic cost benefit curve that you see, and that you see risks. And a lot of times, as we address risk with our actions, we implement options, get more intrusive on the environment. And there's really a cost benefit analysis to this, where when you look at the change in risk and the cost, you get to a point where you're getting marginal changes in risk, but really spending a lot more money to be able to manage those risks. One of the things that's a lot of times lost in this whole concept is the big focus, and the big focus on what we see in decommissioning is what are the potential risks. And what happens, though, when we talk about implementing things that become more intrusive on the environment, there's going to be a situation where, and when you look at this point, where there's a break point where when I go from option 1 to 2, not only am I spending a lot more money, getting a marginal change in risk, but I'm also creating a significant environmental impact, which is the green bar, which then translates to any of those human uses that were in human use values that were associated with it can also be impacted. So it's really trying to consider this overall risk benefit analysis and how do we go about to look at this information and balance it. So the one of the things that in about 15 years ago, looking at this and looking at the original paper that we published in 2004, we think about what we've heard today so far is that these sites, this framework really works, and it's when you need to balance the risks and benefits of an action. The site is ambiguous, and that ambiguity arises when the site retains ecological value, which it does in this case, when the actions are themselves environmentally damaging, and that can definitely be the case as well. And when the ecological risks from the in situ condition are relatively small, uncertain, or limited to a component of the ecosystem, especially in comparison to the potential impacts of the second point there. So the question becomes, what is that trade-off? And so in the context of decommissioning, the thought is that this NEBA framework can actually address that ambiguity that arises in this decision-making process. So, and the other thing too, when you think about consistency with the precautionary principle, that principle implies that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or to the environment in the absence of scientific consensus that the action or policy is not harmful, the burden of proof that is not harmful falls on those taking the action. So when I think about that principle, it sort of rings bell to me. If somebody is making a decision or action or policy to completely remove this, based on the information we know now, it identifies that there is a potential risk of causing harm to the public and those ecosystem services in the environment. So really flipping that concept around, it looks like that principle applies, and why this approach would be available to be able to use to actually compare that, or one of the tools that can be used. So how do we use this to demonstrate the risks and so forth and the benefits? I've been involved in this approach. I've used environmental benefit analysis concepts in over 20 countries. But from offshore decommissioning, multiple, I think over 30 different platforms and a variety of different locations that you can see here. So really looking at this approach and how it can be used to help in the environmental decision-making process. In the comparative assessment process, in a lot of my discussions, not only with operators, but also with a lot of the regulatory agencies, was there some uncertainty in the decision-making that we're seeing by regulators, in that the guidance on comparative assessments is very vague, so they can be done in a wide variety of ways, and sometimes you get a lot of weighting and ranking, which sometimes may affect the rigor and what you see in the results. Is it really scientifically based, and is it replicable? Can you reduce the transparency? Because it's important that to have transparency, and with a lot of the weighting and ranking, that can has the potential to introduce stakeholder bias at that point. And as I mentioned earlier, is a focus on risks, and ecological and social benefits have been understated or overlooked in that decision-making process. So and then, how do you present the results? The agencies were getting, in one jurisdiction, would get a wide variety of different types of comparative assessments. And so for them to be able to analyze and go back forward and replicate what was conducted, they were having a little trouble with that, which it seemed like it was one of the key issues that they had. So the characteristics of approach is really what this approach was looked at was to align it with the regulatory frameworks, address the 5 major factors of health and safety. And it's not just when we say NEBA, net environmental benefit analysis, we're also looking at health and safety, social, economic, and technical factors in this, as well as environmental. And the goal here is to be objective, look at the science, develop it scientifically defendable. Is it, can you replicate it, and really to help develop some consistency on how this process moves forward, and obviously, including relevant stakeholder input. In 2023, just in January of this year, we published this framework, a NEBA-based comparative assessment. And it's really an adaptation of the 2004 paper, but really focused on offshore decommissioning. And it really goes through an analysis planning process, goes through an options analysis, goes through a risk management approach. And in that risk management, it's not just looking at what the science says, but also when you look at that, being able to go through and look at the thresholds in the different values that you're looking at. So we want to bring a quantitation into the approach to help support the scientific rigor in this process. And again, I mentioned stakeholder engagement. This plan, or this approach, the NEBA-based comparative assessment, as I mentioned, it includes those 5 key areas of the economic or financial, technical, social, environmental, and health and safety aspects. But one of the important things this does, and rather than just looking values that you collect at a point in time, it's really important to understand those multi-generational values. Because if I have this platform, for example, providing a certain value today, or a field that's providing a group of platforms providing a certain value today, if that all gets removed, what does that look like into the future? What is the effect on the multi-generational values, on ecological values, and on potential human use values, and so forth? And again, like I say, this approach does not rely on ranking or weighting schemes. When you show a little bit about what the data looks like, but really what's going to happen when you look at this at the end of the day is that you could bring in ranking or weighting towards the end if you wanted to. But the point here is, let's show what the science is demonstrating, and then based on that, at least you have a basis from which, if there is going to be any ranking or weighting, that it can be supported in a particular manner to make it move forward and transparent. And again, the transparency is very important in this regard. In this process, we look at a lot of different types of metrics that we can quantify. This is just a list, and the paper lists all these different variables or metrics. But really, the metrics, we're trying to collect metrics in that variety of areas, and looking at, for example, the hard structure is very important. And that hard structure can be surface areas, volumes. You can develop a complexity for different sections of a platform as you're looking at fisheries data. There's a wide variety of looking at the data, but you're really quantifying these data for each option that you look at. And so we'll look at hard structure. You could look at fisheries biomass, benthic biomass, benthic coverage. Are there other net ecosystem service values you want to incorporate? And there are also some potential negative ones, because when you implement an option, it might create greenhouse gas emissions because you're using more energy and fuel usage to implement, and so on and so forth. We look at the economic and social values, like commercial fishing, fish processing sector, recreational values. You can look at all types of other active values, whether it's diving, passive use values. You can look at potential existence and bequest values, and excuse me. And but the other thing you're trying to do is balance each different option with, what is the effect on risk? Are there navigation risks? If you're going to reef it in place, is there potential navigation risk, or how could you manage that? Could you cut it and create a reef right next to the jacket with an upper portion that you cut? Is there buoyancy risks if you're working with an FPSO, for example, floating production storage offloading unit? Is there potential for trawl snagging risks or potential loss of life? And that's important. And this is where when you look at the exclusion zone, keeping the exclusion zone can actually help to manage some of these. If you keep, for example, keep an area reef, keep an exclusion zone, you can actually help protect that as almost like a marine protected area, but help minimize risk to navigation risk, trawling, and so on and so forth. And are there any residual risks from chemicals or potential from plastics, ecological degradation? And then we'll also look at health and safety risk. When you implement in your campaign to implement all the options that you look at, you will look at these potential loss of life risks, injury risks, and so forth. And then look at the other one that's important is the implementation costs. And implementation costs are important, but within this process, we really focus on with the goal of maximizing the environmental benefits while managing site risks. So implementation costs really in this respect comes in as a second, even though it's very important, it still comes in as a secondary metric because it's really maximizing that value for the public while minimizing risk with that different alternative. And the way the data looks in this, and this here is an example that shows from keeping a site in place, let's say this is a platform, to full removal with potential to do interim cuts and remove the top portions of a platform. This is from a case study in the North Sea. And again, you have detrimental, your risks are on the bottom and pointing downward, your benefits are pointing upward. In general, in this case, and there's multiple scenarios we looked at, but in this case, you could see, as you would expect, as you remove the hard structure, and look at, projected changes in fisheries and these other types of parameters that are beneficial, you get a decline in those benefits. And at the same time, you say, well, what happens to the risks? And because obviously you're spending a lot more effort, some of those actions can reduce risk and other actions can actually create more risk. And the way these are graphed is it's important. Like if you look at cost here on the right, every cost bar is plotted proportional to that cost variable. Because you can see all the metrics down here, they're incorporated in a variety of different types of metrics on different scales. You needed to pull this type of chart together to be able to graph them all on a site. So this allows you to visually compare what that looks like. So is there an optimized option that might work in that case? And at the end of the day, in looking through this process, we're developing something that is objective, transparent, it's flexible, quantitative, and scientifically defendable. And the last thing put on this is it's typically been a desktop study. In some cases, we may need more ROV data, but for the most part, all the data to implement this process is pretty much available from the operator to be able to do these valuations, or it's out in the public where we're able to gather the information to generate those different aspects. So that really opens the risk benefit discussion on for decision making on what we go ahead and do. And with that, that's the end of that. So I appreciate the opportunity to walk through that. I know it was a lot in a little bit of time. So